Removing and replacing parts. HP Compaq 8200 Elite Convertible Mini Tower Business PC.
Tools you need. To remove and replace parts in this device, you should ideally have the following tools on hand: an anti-static wrist strap, a Phillips screwdriver, a flat-bladed pry tool, long nose pliers, a flathead screwdriver, a Torx screwdriver, a triangular pry tool, a pair of tweezers, thermal grease and cleaning alcohol, a suction cup, a cuticle stick, a SIM tray eject pin.
How to replace the access panel. Removal.
Pull out and hold the access panel release latch. Lift the panel away from the chassis.
Replacement.
Slide the lip on the front edge of the access panel under the front chassis guide rail. Lower the back end of the access panel onto the chassis. Press down until it locks in place.
How to replace the front bezel. Before you begin.
Remove the access panel.
Removal.
Pull out on the 3 tabs on the left side of the bezel. Rotate the bezel away from the chassis and remove it.
Replacement.
Insert the 3 hooks on the right side of the bezel into the slots on the chassis. Rotate the bezel against the chassis and press until it snaps into place.
How to replace the optical drive. Before you begin.
Remove the access panel and front bezel.
Removal.
Disconnect the data and power cables from the drive. Pull out on the release latch and slide the drive out of the drive cage. Note, in a desktop configuration, push in on the drive lock to release the drive. Note, if the replacement drive does not include guide screws, remove and reuse the screws from this drive or use the spare screws provided on the drive cage.
Replacement.
Align the guide screws on the drive with the guide slots and slide the drive into the bay until it snaps into place. Connect the power and data cables to the drive.
How to replace the hard drive. Before you begin.
Remove the access panel.
Removal.
Disconnect the data and power cables from the drive. Pull out on the green drive release latch and slide the drive out of the drive cage. Note, if the replacement drive does not include guide screws, remove and reuse the screws from this drive or use the spare screws provided on the drive cage.
Replacement.
Align the guide screws on the drive with the guide slots and slide the drive into the bay until it snaps into place. Connect the power and data cables to the drive.
How to replace the front I/O assembly. Before you begin.
Remove the access panel, front bezel, and any PCI cards blocking access to the connectors.
Removal.
Disconnect the front audio cable from the system board. Disconnect the USB cables from the system board. Remove the Torx 15 screw that secures the assembly to the front of the chassis. Rotate the assembly out of the opening on the front of the chassis. Guide the assembly cables through the openings on the bottom of the drive cage and front of the chassis and remove the assembly.
Replacement.
Guide the assembly cables through the openings on the front of the chassis and bottom of the drive cage. Insert the tabs on the bottom of the assembly into the opening on the front of the chassis. Rotate the assembly against the chassis. Replace the Torx 15 screw that secures the assembly to the chassis. Connect the USB cables to the system board. Connect the front audio cable to the system board.
How to replace the power switch LED assembly. Before you begin,
remove the access panel, front bezel, and front I/O assembly.
Removal.
Disconnect the power switch LED assembly cable from the system board. Press the retaining tabs on the left side of the power switch and rotate it out of the opening on the front of the chassis. Guide the assembly cable through the openings on the bottom of the drive cage and front of the chassis and remove the assembly.
Replacement.
Guide the assembly cable through the openings on the front of the chassis and bottom of the drive cage. Insert the tabs on the right side of the power switch into the opening on the chassis. Press the retaining tabs on the left side of the power switch and rotate it against the chassis until it is securely in place. Connect the power switch LED assembly cable to the system board.
How to replace the speaker. Before you begin,
remove the access panel.
Removal.
Disconnect the speaker cable from the system board. Remove the two Torx 15 screws that secure the speaker to the chassis. Lift the speaker off of the brackets on the chassis wall and remove.
Replacement.
Position the speaker onto the brackets on the chassis wall. Replace the two Torx 15 screws that secure the speaker to the chassis. Connect the speaker cable to the system board.
How to replace the system fan. Before you begin,
remove the access panel.
Removal.
Disconnect the fan cable from the system board. Remove the 4 Phillips head screws that secure the fan to the back of the chassis. Remove the fan from the chassis.
Replacement.
Position the fan against the chassis. Replace the 4 Phillips head screws that secure the fan to the back of the chassis. Connect the fan cable to the system board.
How to replace the memory. Before you begin,
remove the access panel.
Removal.
Push down and out on the memory socket latches to release the memory module. Pull the memory module up and out of the socket.
Replacement.
Ensure that the memory socket latches are pushed down and away from the memory socket. Match the notch on the memory module with a key in the memory socket. Push the module down firmly into the socket until the latches snap into place and the module is fully seated.
How to replace the PCI card. Before you begin,
remove the access panel.
Removal.
Disconnect any cables attached to the PCI card. Press on the 2 green PCI retention clamp clips until they release. Rotate the PCI retention clamp up against the rear of the chassis. Lift straight up on the PCI card to remove it from the socket. Note, if the PCI socket has a locking tab, push out and hold the locking tab while lifting the PCI card. Important: if you're not replacing the PCI card, cover the open slot on the PCI bulkhead with a metal slot cover.
Replacement.
If you're installing a new PCI card, remove the slot cover from the appropriate slot on the PCI bulkhead. Align the connectors on the PCI card with a socket on the system board. Press down on the PCI card until it is fully seated. Rotate the PCI retention clamp down over the PCI bulkhead. Press the two green PCI retention clamp tabs on the rear of the chassis until the clips lock into place. Connect any cables to the PCI card.
How to replace the RTC battery. Before you begin,
remove the access panel and any PCI cards blocking access to the battery.
Removal.
Insert a flat bladed tool into the slot at the front of the socket and push to release the battery. Lift the battery out of the socket.
Replacement.
Slide the battery into the socket with the plus sign facing up.
How to replace the heat sink. Before you begin,
remove the access panel.
Removal.
Disconnect the heatsink fan cable from the system board. Loosen the 4 captive Torx 15 retaining screws by partially unscrewing one pair of diagonally opposite screws and then partially unscrewing the remaining pair until all the screws are loose. Gently twist the heatsink off of the processor and remove it from the chassis. Do not use excessive force to pull it off.
Replacement.
Note: the thermal grease between the processor and heatsink should be replaced every time the heatsink is removed. Carefully remove the old thermal grease from the heatsink and processor by scraping it off with a straight plastic edge and alcohol swab. Then use an alcohol swab to remove any thermal grease residue. Use a thermal grease applicator to apply the proper amount of grease along one edge of the processor. Then use the edge of a clean piece of paper to spread the thermal grease evenly over the top of the processor. Position the heatsink on top of the processor and align the 4 retaining screws with the holes on the system board. Tighten the 4 retaining screws by partially tightening one pair of diagonally opposite screws and then tightening the remaining pair. Connect the heatsink fan cable to the system board.
How to replace the processor. Before you begin,
remove the access panel and heatsink.
Removal.
Important: before removing the processor, take special note of the gold triangle on one corner and the notches on 2 sides of the processor. The processor must be installed in the same orientation in which it was removed, or it may be destroyed. Push down and out on the processor load plate lever, and then raise the lever and processor load plate until it is fully open. Lift the processor to remove. Important: always handle the processor by its sides. Do not touch the contacts on the underside of the processor or inside the processor socket. Damaging the contacts may result in processor failure.
Replacement.
Align the processor in the correct orientation and carefully place it straight down into the socket. Lower the load plate over the processor socket. Lower the load plate lever and place it securely into its latch. Important: after installing a new processor, be sure to update the BIOS to the latest revision or to the version requested by the customer.
How to replace the power supply. Before you begin,
remove the access panel.
Removal.
Disconnect the power cables from all of the drives and the system board, noting their location for reinstallation. Remove the power cables from the clip on the chassis pan. Remove the 4 Torx 15 screws that secure the power supply to the back of the chassis. Press the release latch on the chassis pan and slide the power supply away from the back of the chassis. Lift the power supply out of the chassis.
Replacement.
Align the power supply with the guides in the chassis. Slide the power supply to the back of the chassis. Replace the 4 Torx 15 screws that secure the power supply to the back of the chassis. Replace the power cables into the clip on the chassis pan. Connect the power cables to the drives and system board.
How to replace the system board. Before you begin,
remove the access panel, PCI cards, memory, heatsink, and processor.
Removal.
Disconnect all cables from the system board, noting their location for reinstallation. Remove the 10 Torx 15 screws that secure the board to the chassis. Slide the system board toward the front of the chassis to disengage it from the rear I/O panel. Rotate the system board up and lift the board out of the chassis.
Replacement.
Lower the board into the chassis and align it with the rear I/O panel ports. Slide the board against the rear I/O panel. Make sure the screw holes on the board are aligned with the mounting holes in the chassis. Replace the 10 Torx 15 screws. Replace the first screw on one corner of the system board, and then replace the second screw at the opposite corner. Replace the remaining 8 screws. Reconnect all cables to the system board. Important: after installing a new system board, be sure to update the BIOS to the latest revision or to the version requested by the customer.
Find more helpful videos on our HP Support YouTube channel.